Hello, welcome back to the channel, or welcome. Today we are finally doing the long-awaited, updated tips for using gouache. I have my notes ready, sketchbook and palette. Let's do it. I separated it into 3 sections. First, we're going to start with just answering a couple questions I got from you guys. Next, we'll go over just some basics for using gouache. And then third, I'm going to do a painting and hopefully demonstrate kind of some of the ways that I use gouache. Hopefully it'll be really helpful, and let's just get started. Okay, the first question comes from Tovi Art, and they ask how to get smooth areas of the same color without it getting uneven. So the easiest way is to use a pre-mixed color, ideally right out of the tube where you have plenty of it and you don't have to worry about remixing. The next tip is to use layers for like background areas and areas where I want it to be perfectly the same color. Like if I was doing a black background, I would do at least 2 layers, maybe 3 if it didn't come out perfect in those 2. This way you can also use a bit more water so that the paint flows easier, because you don't want the edges of your paint drying while you work, because that will give you some of the blotchiness. So where you can, also using a bigger brush that holds a bit more paint can help. I'm just going to paint a big rectangle here, but you want to mix a lot of water so you can keep the edges wet and continue to pull the paint forward somewhere in a way that you would with like watercolors. If you're going around something more detailed, you will most likely have to switch between 2 brushes, a thinner brush for going around the details and your bigger brush for pulling paint quickly. But if you wanted to do this in 1 layer, especially if you were working on something like hot press paper, you would have to work so freaking fast. Since all this is wet, I can just continue to pull it forward. And I didn't clip my paper down, so it's probably going to pull a little bit in the edges from warping. I'm gonna add a little bit more paint. Since it's wet, it should redistribute a bit as it dries. And that's the first layer. Alright, that took forever, but this is now completely dry. I'm going to go in with my second layer. I purposely picked a color that I knew would dry super blotchy. And now hopefully with the second layer, be able to fix this. I'm going in slightly thicker this time. Still want it wet enough to be able to pull it easily. Don't want the paint to ever feel dry. We want a little puddle that is thick enough that it's easy to control, but not so watery that it's just kind of going all over the place. We want the edges to stay wet, so even when I'm working up here, I'm going to come down and reactivate that edge. And I think I should be able to get away with 2 layers on this, even with this light color that tends to dry blotchy. If you have a color that's particularly transparent or difficult to work with, you might need to do 3 layers. If I see any area where the paper seems to be showing through a little bit, I'm just gonna go over it while it's still super wet and add a little bit more paint in those areas. Okay, I think that should be good. The most important part when you're doing layers is just to make sure that each layer is 100% dry before moving on to the next one. But one thing before we do move on with like making a smooth background, and third option, which doesn't really answer the question of getting a smooth background, but is that you can just not care about whether or not the layer is perfect. I don't think it's ever bad to be able to see the like artist hand in something that is painted. Obviously, if it's like super blotchy and you hate the way it looks, like You don't want that, but the unevenness in some ways could add some character, so leaning into that is always an option. So here's this dry. I wouldn't say it's perfect, there's a couple dots, but I think it's pretty good for 2 layers. You could definitely do a 3rd layer if you need it to be absolutely perfect. Okay, for the next question, Sasha Fitzgerald asks, how do you deal with the color change when gouache dries? So if you're unfamiliar, gouache, darker colors get lighter as they dry, and lighter colors can sometimes get darker as they dry. And honestly, for this one, you just kind of have to get used to it. There are some ways that you can get an idea of how a color is going to look before it's dry. Swatching is a big one. You're going in with a tiny little section of paint and it will dry quickly, and then you have an idea. And plus, if you're doing it right on the same paper that you will be painting on, you even get an idea of what it will look on the white of the page. But I mean, it's kind of just something you have to get used to. I find that even watercolor kind of does this. It's more of like when it goes down, it's more saturated and it kind of desaturates when it dries. Gouache does this as well. But another benefit of doing this is just since you're swatching all the colors together, you get to see how the colors look right next to each other. Getting the little blob of paint off the end of your paintbrush helps with your lines being smoother. If you're doing thinner washes of paint, it can help you see how the colors might dry on top of each other. You're just going to have to build up the instinct, but for the most part for this, I really just try not to think about it too much. A big part of painting is just fixing things as you go. So if it dries a little bit lighter than you wanted it to, you can always go back in and darken it. If it dries a little bit too dark, you can go back in and lighten it. The next question is from Veronic_OS, and they ask, for color mixing, which colors mix together better, and is there a limit? This is kind of a vague question. Honestly, for this one, I know there's probably some right answer or like something that you would probably learn in art school, but I didn't go to art school, and I think a lot of it is just personal taste. There's a lot of great videos on color theory if you're interested. I think for the most part, you can really just do whatever you like the look of, but there are a few things that you could keep in mind. So mixing together too many pigments can sometimes start to look a bit muddy. So if you want your colors to stay clear and more saturated, you could stick to the same side of the color wheel, in a similar area. If you want to desaturate colors, you would go across the color wheel. So for keeping the saturation, you might mix a green and a blue together. And for the most part, that color is going to stay pretty bright and saturated. To desaturate, you could take that same blue and mix a tiny bit of orange into it, and that's going to desaturate that blue instead. I'll put the original blue on there as well. If you do too much of the orange into the blue, you might start get a more muddy type color, but that might be exactly what you're looking for, and that's why I think it's more personal taste than anything, because I mean, honestly, what's wrong with that color? If it's used right with other colors, it could be perfectly fine. Like I said earlier, your swatch sheet is your best friend when it comes to this. Mix your colors, check it on your little swatch, see if the colors work well together, and adjust if they don't. I will say, because of the way gouache works, it's a little bit harder to cover up something that has gotten muddy, so really use your swatch sheet so that you don't have to worry about covering things up if you don't have to. I really recommend playing with your paint to kind of see how your colors work together, because a lot of us are not working with perfect primaries and secondary colors. We have all kinds of different colors on our palette. For my self-portrait that I did recently, I did a whole page of just testing colors and mixing different colors together to kind of see what I could get. So for this is a color wheel I made using as close to the primaries with my own colors I could get. And then this one is more of the colors that I would probably use. So if I was going to continue filling out this color wheel, I have my green and my blue, and I would mix those together to see what I would get. And then I could put that here. Same with this one. Mix that same blue, but with purple instead. And yeah, it doesn't have to be a color wheel like this. You could literally just do swatches on your sheet to see what the colors look like together, but I really recommend doing something like this, whether you work with primary colors or you work with just a bunch of pre-mixed colors instead. And then here is my finished color wheels. This is the regular one, and then this one is more colors that I would normally use, more of my color palette. What's interesting is I see a couple of colors here that this one is basically the same color as just scarlet red. This one that's a mix between the crimson red and the lilac is basically the magenta or rose color I have on my palette. And the mix between the cerulean blue and the lilac is basically the ash blue that I have on my palette that I love. But to show what I meant about messing with your own colors, show you here's the page I was talking about for my self-portrait where I was messing with the colors. I basically went through and picked all the colors I thought I might be able to use for the painting, and then when I picked out the ones I thought I was going to go with, I then went and mixed each of them together to see what kind of colors I could get. I did end up switching my blue for a brighter blue, but yeah, that's how I got to see what colors I could make, and the fact that I did need a brighter blue rather than the ash blue I had picked out. And then here is my swatch for the painting. That's the painting, here's the swatches. Really useful. Okay, this is still wet, but I think you can get a good idea of what I mean about mixing colors together. So all these center colors, I mixed a little bit of the color across the color wheel in, so they're a little muddy, and I mean individually they're fine. You could even do a whole painting of just these colors, but I think it would look a lot better if you at least had a pop of some clear colors in. And then one last note on color mixing. I always think that you should have a higher quality white. I really like this one from Da Vinci, the Da Vinci Permanent Artist Gouache in titanium white. It's my go-to one. If you have questions about my palette, I made a full video going over every color in my palette, swatching and talking a little bit about the whole setup. So if that's something that you have questions about, I will have that linked in the description, or you can just go back on my channel to 2 videos ago. I hope I was able to answer your questions in a helpful way. For the next part, I'm going to start going through just some basic tips. I'm going to do that while I work on sketching out what I will paint for this video. It's just a 4x6 inch piece of watercolor paper. For the first tip, and you're probably aware of this if you do any kind of painting, but you should always try to keep your sketch as light as possible, or even use a colored lead like I am here. And for this, I'm just using a old selfie of mine, and I'll have it up on the screen. That way, if you want to paint the same thing, you can. Now, I did this one when we first started recording, but make sure to wet your paints ahead of time so the water can soak into the paints and make them creamy for when you're painting. When learning, it is better to start with small paintings just because you can quickly cover more of the canvas. I think it's important to do the full process of a painting start to finish to really understand the whole process. So that's why I'm doing a 4x6 inch painting for this. It allows me to cover a lot of surface area pretty quickly. now we are ready to get started on painting. And get my palette. I'm actually gonna swap you, so the palette's on the other side. Okay, hopefully this setup works for you. Tried to get it in a way where you can see all the palette, and that just wasn't possible. So I'm gonna try to do my mixing here so you can see what I'm doing. So for the rest of the basic tips, I already covered it briefly when I talked about painting the smooth area of one color, but you always need to make sure that what you're painting on is completely dry, either completely wet or completely dry. If it is half wet, you will just end up picking up the paint you just put down. So make sure all your layers are completely dry before trying to blend or putting a new layer on top. Next tip is keep a scrap piece of paper for swatching, ideally the same kind of paper that you are painting on. If you are working in your sketchbook, you can just use a corner like I do a lot of the time. And I'm just going to continue to use what I was using earlier. So I tend to work from dark to light, and most of that's just because I don't want to lose my lines. So the first step for me is usually go in and put in some of the lines around the eyes and any of the darkest dark areas that I would like to make sure I keep for contrast. Once the paint is completely dry, you can use a damp brush to gently blend. It's important to keep the brush clean and just barely wet. Be careful not to lift too much paint up. This works best when you already have a good base of paint down on the page. When you get your top layers wet, they'll bleed down into your lower layers. So if you are changing a color drastically, you'll probably need to go over it a few times or use less water, thicker paint. Now with the basics out of the way, I'm going to start working on a painting so I can show you how I would apply the stuff to an actual piece of artwork. I will talk you through the process a bit so you can see how I'm thinking about it while I work. So water-based gouache is really cool because you can use it with a lot of water and it will bloom out like watercolors. But if you use less water, you'll get a more opaque experience. Either way, the paint can be reactivated after it dries, which makes it perfect for palettes, but also means that you can do some cool stuff with layering, since your top layers will bleed down into your lower layers and kind of combine. When you paint over an area, the top layers reactivate the layers below, so they kind of blend together instead of just sitting on top of each other like watercolors do or like acrylic. When I paint with gouache, I like to start with pretty thin layers with more water. This way you can quickly cover the white of the page. The next layers will be a little bit thicker to refine the details. I tend to work from dark to light. Even with watercolors, that's just a personal preference to get my most important lines in early so I don't lose them in the layers of paint later. This also helps with picking colors later. If you already have your darkest points in early, you can see if the composition is balanced right away. At this stage, when I'm doing the first thin layer of paint for the face, I'm trying to focus on getting kind of blocks of color down, using my reference as a guide. It doesn't need to be perfect. The colors can even be exaggerated. It really just needs to give me something to work with for the next layers, where I'll do the actual refining and smooth some of this out a bit. Sometimes just changing the background color changes how all the other colors look together. So I also tend to try to fill in the background pretty early. I feel like if I leave it until the last step, I will need to go back in and end up making a lot more adjustments to the rest of the painting. With the background and hair filled in enough to see how they'll affect the surrounding colors, it's time for me to start refining. For me, usually that means bringing contrast back to the eyes and the nose and the mouth and starting to lock in more details. I start darkening up areas of shadow and lightening up areas where highlights will be. Then with slightly thicker paint, I start going in with my second layer of color blocking. And the places where the paper was showing through start to look a bit more smooth. I might blend a little at this stage when putting two colors next to each other, but mostly I'm focusing on building up the face. After finishing the details with the thicker paint, I go in with thin layers again, like washes, to adjust the colors or just add some interest. Normally I also do my blending at the same time, jumping around the painting, adjusting anything I don't like the look of. A softer watercolor brush is good for this. The stiffer ones are a little hard to blend with. I probably spend the most time on this stage of a painting. I'll fix one thing, then notice something else to fix, then I'll just keep jumping around the painting. Since the sections are small and I'm not using a lot of water, I don't really need to worry about letting the paint dry while I'm working like this. And I can just get into the fun flow state of painting. Try not to blend everything out too perfectly or too smoothly. Things look better when there's a mix of hard lines and soft blended lines. If you overblend, either causing you to lose contrast or a necessary sharp line, you can just go back in and reintroduce that edge or add in some contrast again. A lot of blending is just pushing and pulling until you find the right balance. Then one last tip, this is less for portraits but more as a base for anything else. I'll be showing it in the hair for this painting, but I've also used it to quickly block in backgrounds or to paint simple objects. You can usually paint most things using just 3 colors. All you need is a base color that's around a mid-tone, a shadow color, and a highlight. Put them vaguely in the same area on the color wheel so they look normal together, and it should work pretty well. Then you can go in with more variety and add some interest in areas if you want. But for quickly filling in shapes, those 3 colors are all you really need to make a background or whatever look pretty good as a starting point. It also helps you not put too much focus on areas that aren't supposed to be the focus of the painting. So for the hair, I'm working on top of my base layer that will kind of be the mid-tone. First, I will quickly block in my shadows using a darker color. Next, a lighter color to lay out where I want highlights to go. Then I'll go back in with that mid-tone in a second layer before starting to blend. When blending, if I notice a layer needs to be darker or lighter or changed, I'll also just do it then, as well as add in my flyaways and any fun details I want to add. I like to save my brightest white highlights for last so they don't get blended or covered. This is also a good time to darken any areas that got lightened when blending or drying. Alright, that's the video. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, please subscribe and like the video if you liked it, and I will see you guys soon.